All right, so we are recording now, so I'm going to go ahead and start our presentation here. And please, I know we've got a couple of LegalServer folks on with me, so if you're having any trouble seeing my screen at all, please let me know here. So we are going to, of course, talk about online intake today. So I'm going to just start by talking about what is online intake. So essentially, an online intake is going to allow an organization to provide an online application process to the public. And who the public is sometimes varies just based on the purpose of your online intake. So most often that's going to be actual clients or applicants who could become clients, but sometimes also representatives of clients. So people such as social workers, guardian ad litem, healthcare advocates for things like MLP referrals. So it could be a various kind of audience who might be actually entering your online intakes. So don't think of it as just client-facing, but it can also be, again, representatives of clients. The online intake itself is hosted by a completely separate LegalServer site and transferred to your organization's existing LegalServer site using the electronic case transfer feature. So when you purchase online intake, it's going to automatically also come with the electronic case transfer module so that those cases can be transferred between your two instances of LegalServer. So it's important just to know that if you get online intake, you are going to have a completely separate LegalServer site. So it's going to be a totally separate instance. Couple of kind of main reasons for that. Number one is security. You don't have to give access or logins to all of your folks to your online intake site. Really only people that need to log in there would be those that are going to be making configuration changes and or running any reports in your online intake site, because you will have full reporting capability there as well. The other main reason that it's a separate site from your main instance of LegalServer is to keep those conflicts separate. So if someone fills out an online intake, it's not automatically creating a conflict in your regular database. So there's going to be a process you have to actually step through to accept that case into your regular site and therefore make it part of your regular database. All right, I'm checking the chat. So there are a couple of folks just mentioning some audio issues possibly. It sounds like for most folks, it's just fine. For anyone that does have audio issues, it can sometimes be helpful to call in instead of joining with your computer audio. So that might be something you want to give a try. And then I do see a question which is asking if you have to purchase the electronic case transfer module as well, or if it's included. It is included in the pricing for online intake. So you really can't have online intake without being able to transfer. So it is included in the purchase of online intake. All right, and the last thing just to mention about what is online intake here is just to say that online intakes can also be set up to transfer to multiple other LegalServer sites. So think about things like a regional or statewide online intake. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the context of what they're doing down in Florida. But basically, you could have one online intake site that gets routed to multiple LegalServer programs. So something like, again, a statewide site where everyone goes to one place to submit their application, and then based on things like where they live, what county are they in, or what type of legal issue do they have, they can be routed to the correct agency. All right, so the next thing to just talk a little bit about is how an online intake actually gets built. So as you've probably already inferred, it is a separate module. You have to tell us if you want it. So we'll go through the process of getting that turned on for you and getting that additional site up for you. Typically, as far as just to mention the URL of the online intake site, it will be your site name plus OI at the end. And it does have the same process where we have a demo online intake site. Once you have that configured, we spin up the live version. And of course, that will then transfer to your live version of LegalServer, your regular site. But basically, there are two kind of options for building out your online intake. So once we have that site set up for you, you can go in there and configure and build your online intake yourself. So if you're a site administrator and you already are really familiar with all of the configuration tools, you are able to do that. The other option, of course, is to contract some hours with us here at LegalServer to help you with building out that configuration. And I just put in here a standard build requires approximately 10 to 20 hours. There are buckets of time that you can purchase for our help, and it really just depends on how complex you are planning to build out your online intake. But that's a pretty reasonable range for generally how long a standard build would take. Also, just a note that the online intakes are built and can be later updated, of course, with largely the same tools as a regular site. So if you are familiar with adding new fields on your site, with adding new fields to a form, with building out some branch logic, all of those same tools are going to be utilized on your online intake site as well. There are a couple of key differences as far as configuration goes. One of those is what we call the online intake specific blocks. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about these later, and I'll describe a couple of specific examples. But there are some online intake specific blocks for you to utilize in place of some of the regular blocks you might see throughout an intake, like the financial information, things like that. There's also the step of having to transfer custom fields from one site to the other. So if you want to utilize any custom fields on your online intake, those fields have to exist on both sites. So you would create them on one site, transfer them to the other. So that's something a little bit different that you wouldn't have to do on just your regular site. And then the last one is just the naming of the steps of online intake. So when we look at a couple of examples of online intakes, you're going to notice that the front end user is going to see the steps of the online intake. So that's also something that's just a little bit extra with online intake that you'll have to configure. And I see a question in the chat, which is, can this be used as a sign-up page? So I'm not quite sure what you mean by a sign-up page, so apologies. But basically what an online intake is going to do is create a case in your system. So it's for, any cases that need to be built in your system. So again, it typically would be an actual applicant who, wants to become your client. But it can also be something like a healthcare worker who is entering that information on behalf of the client. But it is going to create a case record in the system. And I see a question of, can this create a pre-screen instead of a case? At this point, it cannot. It's just going to create case records. You, of course, can decide once this gets transferred to you, things like what type of intake process should it have to go through after that. But it is going to create a case record, not a pre-screen record. All right, so moving on here. This page is just some decisions that you'll need to make before you go and build out your online intake. And this would be relevant whether or not you are going to have our help with some of those hours, or if you're just planning on building it out on your own. So what you want to decide is what information you're going to be collecting with your online intake. Oftentimes, it's better to keep things a little bit simpler than your regular intake for ease of entry with your applicant. And obviously, this does change a little bit if, it's not going to be actual applicants, but someone on behalf of the applicant who might have a little bit more legal knowledge and things like that. But you just want to make sure that it's simple enough that whoever is going to be filling out the online intake is going to be able to do it pretty accurately. So totally up to you on what information, what data you're actually collecting with your online intake. Also, just to keep in mind, there is, of course, a benefit to using simple client-friendly language. So again, you don't want to, use a ton of legal jargon that people are just not going to understand, and they might just abandon the online intake if they're afraid of all of the wording on the page, or they're not quite sure how to answer certain questions. So there's certainly a benefit to making sure your language is nice and simple. And then lastly on here, determining if you are going to have any branch logic or utilize our new guided navigation to automatically kick an applicant out of the intake or to just ask additional questions. So you can utilize branch logic or guided navigation to, in a similar way that you're using it possibly in your regular intake where you just want to ask more questions or for different information based on a previous answer. But you can also utilize it to essentially kick people out of your online intake and weed them out of the process. So if they, for instance, say they have a criminal issue, you're not able to help with those, you can send them to an exit page where they're going to be notified that you can't help with those issues, and you could maybe, send them some other resources. So you're going to have to decide that pretty early on in the process if you want any of those types of exit points. Oh, I see Jeff is grabbing some answers in the chat for me. Thank you, Jeff. And I do see a question about the communication manager. Yes, that is a totally separate module from the online intake. All right, so I already mentioned a little bit about how we have some online intake specific blocks available to utilize an online intake. And there are certain places where you are certainly going to want to utilize those instead of their regular counterparts. And the reason for that really varies by block. So for instance, the financial information online intake block doesn't show things like percentage of poverty and eligibility and allow an applicant to override their own eligibility, things that would probably scare and confuse applicants. Or that we just wouldn't want them to give them the option to do, like that override. Another example would be the opposing parties block. So it's not going to show all of your conflict checking. Again, something that applicants don't need to see, that they wouldn't have any use for, and that would probably just confuse them. And then the last one I just wanted to point out specifically was the online intake legal problem code block. This one is really handy because it comes with another set of lookups that connect to your regular legal problem code values. So the purpose of that is so that we can show some more plain language values to the applicant instead of your standard legal problem code values. So for instance, instead of showing the applicant 01 bankruptcy/debtor relief, we can just show them the word bankruptcy. They select that as their legal issue, and they move on throughout the online intake and they submit. That case comes in to your regular site. It gets transferred over as an 01 bankruptcy debtor relief case because those two values were connected together in your online intake site. So you can choose whatever types of plain language, we call those descriptive versions of legal problem code, that connect to those regular values. In general, all of these special blocks are going to transfer their values to their regular counterparts. So, if someone enters financial information through the special online intake financial block, it gets transferred over to your regular site and shows up in that regular financial block that you're used to. So it's not like data is going to live in two different places. It just is a different type of entry for them. And I see a question in the chat, which is, we are currently implementing online intake and the problem category is in the first part of the intake process and the problem code description is at the end of the application process. Can the category and problem description be placed closer in the process to avoid the applicant completing demographic, financial information, and then be telling we can't assist? The answer is absolutely yes. So most of the time, those category and code are going to be on the same page. So that you would choose your category like housing or consumer issue, and then automatically be prompted to select the specific legal problem code. Like if I chose housing, landlord tenant or eviction or my different types of housing issues. So yes, it could be that they were on separate pages. You can certainly configure it that way. But you absolutely can have those both asked on the same page. And they can actually show in that same block. All right, so the first kind of example that I want to share with you of an online intake, we're going to look at a really simple example. We're actually going to be just taking a peek at our base online intake site, which is where new online intakes get copied from. So when you get an online intake site, you're going to have this really basic process already there for you. So you can step through it, you can kind of just see how it works. You can tweak it if it's kind of close to what you want. You kind of want a simple online intake. You can just tweak it from there, or you could build out a totally separate new one if you want it to be very different. But really simple example we're going to look at, usually includes a page or two of a basic introduction, a welcome, some information about how to use the site, and any agreements that you want people to select. So they need to maybe click to agree that they understand, filling out this online intake doesn't create the relationship between them and a lawyer or anything like that. So any agreements you might want, you can have up front. And then, of course, collection of things like basic contact info, demographics, financial data, maybe one or two exit points. So if they say they have a criminal issue or they're in a county that you're not able to service, you could send them to one of those exit pages. So that is going to be our first example. So I'm actually going to click out of our slideshow here and pop into that intake. So this is, again, just our base online intake process. So you're going to notice that a lot of this is just kind of generic wording, so things like welcome language and fake phone numbers and things like that. But again, just a really kind of simple example of what your online intake could look like. So I had mentioned before that one piece of online intake configuration is to name your steps. So that's what you're seeing up at the top here. These are all just configuration naming. This would be our first kind of page, some welcome language. I have to agree to something. Just to show you an example, if I say no, I can be kicked out to an exit page. So I'm going to have an exit page. It's going to tell me, why we weren't able to submit your application, maybe give a phone number if they want to call, or I could also have some resources and things available here. I can have something like a restart button that kicks me right back to the front. And this time I'm going to say that, yes, I'm going to go ahead and agree. So again, really basic information here that we're collecting. So some contact info. I'll just go ahead and fill out really quickly so you can see the rest of our blocks that I want to show you here. So you'll notice, things like the address block still have that zip code functionality. The site doesn't have all that set up since it's just a base site, but you also, get to choose what types of contact info you're collecting here. You, of course, get to decide if anything should be required, like we see our little date of birth asterisk there for that field being required. And of course, whatever fields are collected on each page is up to you as well. Oh, and I see a question about having this online intake in multiple languages. So we will talk about that and look at a little example of that as well. So just bear with me on that question. This is an example of the opposing party's online intake specific block. So this is the one that's going to transfer data right to your regular adverse party block. But again, it looks a little bit different. It doesn't have, obviously all of the conflict checking, but I can still come in here and enter an individual or an organization as my adverse party, and also add multiple rows there. So still the same basic functionality as our adverse party block, but again, just a little bit more applicant friendly. We also have our financial information block for you to look at as well. So again, this one is the online intake specific. So again, same type of entry. We're choosing an income source. We're choosing a frequency and also an amount. Obviously, too, this configuration can be a little bit different. So you, for instance, might want to default the frequency to monthly and ask them just to enter their monthly amount. You might want to default a couple of types of income so that they have to enter employment. Even if they don't have any, they can put 0. So really lots of different options here, just like with your regular financial block. Ignore this. This is just a field that should be hidden. And then we have our problem code block here as well. So this is the last one I wanted to specifically show you. So this is the one where I have my descriptive values. So my category can be housing, my legal problem code can be landlord-tenant, and my special legal problem code can be something like repairs. So instead of having, I think it's 67 landlord-tenant, you just have your plain language here. And again, you get to decide what those descriptive values are. You can also have something like a text box for them to enter more information about their problem. And then from there, I don't think the rest of this application is set up because, of course, we don't have it to transfer anywhere. It's just our base site. But you'd be able to do things like have a review page so they can see what they've typed in. And then, of course, you would have your transfer block to actually get it to transfer over as well. So that's just a really basic, simple example of an online intake. I'm going to pop back into our slides here. So the next one that I wanted to just point out was a more complex example. So this would be a complex example, would be what they have out in Utah. So this little screenshot on the right is just showing you one of their forms. So those are all of the branch logic blocks on one of their forms. To be fair, we built this out before guided navigation was available, so it would be much less complex to build in this logic now that we have guided navigation. This was all back when we just had branch logic to work with. So it'll be a little bit less crazy looking with guided nav. But I just wanted to share with you again that you can have a much more complex example. So you'll notice on Utah, they also have things like their kind of letterhead essentially on the top here. So you can do more fancy things like that. And this is also going to show us an example of that additional language. So they have their intake available in English and Spanish. When I choose Spanish, the intake changes a little bit. You're going to notice, for instance, my continue button has changed. My steps have changed to Spanish. And when I click through our online intake, we're going to see everything from instructions to continue buttons to exit buttons to all of our fields and blocks and everything, all translated into that language that I've selected. And this one's just English and Spanish, but you could have multiple different languages. You would just tell us, you would buy it by the language, and you would just tell us which languages you want available. And then you can go in and put all of those various translations in. And they happen automatically from there once that language is chosen on the first step. So as long as you have this block, it's just called the process language block, you'd be able to have the applicant select that on the very first step, and the rest of the intake is going to follow along in that language. All right, so one other thing that we kind of touched on a little bit, but that I just wanted to show you an example of here as well, is again, just reading people out through the online intake. So online intake can be, really powerful tool. And one of the things that can make it powerful is just making sure that applicants that come to you are really going to be, eligible for your services. So you don't necessarily want to get 10,000 online intakes in a month and only 100 of those people are actually people you can help. So one way to make sure that happens is by utilizing some of these exit points. So for instance, this is also just a screenshot from the Utah online intake, but this one is just based on, a question about having a traffic ticket or other type of criminal case. And I've selected yes, and I get a message that says, I'm sorry, we can't help you. It also can be connected to some resources. So as you note on the last page, it says, select continue to find other places that might be able to help you. And it can bring you to a page like this. So, here are some resources. It can be based on just the fact that they selected a criminal issue. It might be based on the fact that you asked them their legal problem code and they said bankruptcy and you don't help with bankruptcy, but there's another legal aid in your area that might be able to help. You can have their link or their information. So you can really provide whatever resources make sense based on why you're exiting them from your online intake. You can't really tell here, but this 211 website, this is actually a link. so that they'd be able to click and go right to that resource website. Also really important to note is that your exit buttons can direct to other websites as well. So this note is saying that if you select exit to end this program, you're going to be automatically directed to that 211 website. So I click exit, I leave the online intake, and I go right to that website. So any of your exit buttons can be configured to any outside website as well. So sometimes, you might just want to exit them to your website or just to Google if you're just having them exit, or again, to a resource like this. So we already kind of talked a little bit more about multiple language support, and I showed you that example on Utah. This screenshot is coming from the Florida online intake, where they have 3 languages available. So you can complete their online intake in English, Spanish, or Creole. So you'll just notice this would be the first page of their online intake. They would have the instructions in each of those languages. And then again, the applicant would select their language they want to utilize. And from there, the rest of the intake would show in that language. The other last kind of thing that we talked about as far as main kind of options for your online intake and how it is set up is the fact that you can utilize online intake as a statewide or regional type of intake as well. So as I mentioned, they are doing something like that down in Florida. So in Florida, they have, I think it's actually expanded since I took this screenshot, but they have one online intake, the Florida online intake, that can be routed to 4, or I think it might be up to around 6 different programs that use LegalServer. So there's just one place for applicants to go. They go to this online intake site, they fill out their application, and based on the county of residence that they select, they're routed to one of these different legal agencies. So if I say that I'm in Dade County, my case is going to get sent to the Legal Services of Greater Miami. If I say that I am in Tampa, I can't remember that county, it's going to send me to Bay Area Legal Services. And this one just happens to be based just on county, but there are other statewide or regional intakes that are also utilizing things like problem codes. So if it's a family issue in Dade County, I might go to LSGMI, but if it's a housing issue, it might go to another agency. So you can really utilize whatever kind of criteria you want to decide how to route those intakes. And this link that we have on there was just an example of that page that I had the screenshot of, just to show you kind of how they're doing that routing. So they're utilizing those conditional branch logic blocks, and they're able to, again, just select it based on county. So if I get this to, there we go. So if you look under each of the blocks, again, it's going to go to LSGMI if they're in Miami-Dade or Monroe County. And then if we look at the next one, it's going to go to Bay Area if they're in Hillsborough, Manatee, etc. So that's just, again, an example of how you could build out that statewide or regional online intake and then have multiple partners where those cases get routed to. All right, so that was everything I had in my slide deck here to share about online intake today. I do see that we have a couple more questions to chat, so let me get to those. So I see a question, how does it work if you need to have it in multiple languages? So we probably already answered that kind of throughout what I was just saying. But again, basically you would tell us which languages you need when we set up online intake, or you can always add those in, after you've got your online intake live and you might want to add an additional language later. We would set that up. You get that block that you would put on your first step of intake where the applicant will be able to select the language they prefer. And then there are kind of various ways on how you would get those translations in. So for fields, it's mainly label. So you know how you can relabel a field on a form? You would have the option to put in your Spanish or Creole or whatever other language is. For lookup values, you're going to add those right in the lookup. So as you're naming lookups, you would again have that Spanish version option for each lookup value that you're adding into your site. And then most of your blocks are just going to automatically have labels and things translated for you. So there's a little bit of magic in there where, you know, things like your name block are going to automatically transfer last name, first name, and all of those various labels throughout the block. Another question is the text box character limited. So based on the time of that question, I'm guessing we're talking about that problem code text box that I had, the problem description. And the answer is that I think there is a theoretical limit for text fields in LegalServer, but it's really, really high. So essentially no limit for the text that you enter into that box. I also see a question, if there are multiple programs part of the statewide intake based on county, can there be any customization to a program sharing the statewide process? Or does the online intake have to be uniform so that it does not affect the other programs' online intake process? So it really just depends on how you configure things. So if you put in some branch logic, for instance, to say, well, when they're in Hillsborough County, that's going to be sent to Bay Area. So they also want to know that person's social security number. So we're going to ask that if they say they're in Hillsborough County. You can do some branch logic so that questions only appear or are only required or things like that based on whatever criteria is going to affect where that case gets sent to. But in general, if it is just one site, statewide or regional intake, it is going to be the same process that gets routed to those various places. So changes would affect, you know, everyone who visits that online intake. Oh, and I see Jeff answered that question in the chat as well. So yeah, thank you, Jeff. Pretty much the same answer there. Another question is, can applicants upload any documents to the online intake platform? Yes, they can. There is a step that developers have to just kind of flip a switch to get those documents to transfer with your online intake. So you would have to just let us know that you are planning to do that and that you want those documents to transfer, but it is possible. So we have a way for them to upload documents, and then those could be transferred along with the case. And I see another question, which is we want to use online intake with providers. The provider would fill in very basic information. We review and run conflict checks. If it's okay, we'll want the provider to continue the online intake process. Can you go back into continue? So unfortunately, it is kind of one per session. So if you leave your online intake session, you would not be able to go back and continue with it. Obviously, there's you know, timeline connected to your site's timeout. So if it's set to an hour, I'm not active with my online intake for an hour, I wouldn't be able to go back into it. So it is kind of just one immediate session. What you could do is you could have the providers do the basic online intake. It could get transferred to your site. You would be able to do your conflict check. You would review it, decide if you want to move forward with that case. If you do, you would accept it on your side. You would create a case in your regular database, and then you could utilize external forms for those providers to give you more data. So once you've accepted the case into your regular database, you could create that external form to send to them to say, okay, well, now I need to know, you know, these extra 10 data points or whatever else information they would be adding in at that point. So the answer is not just with online intake, but definitely something you could set up through the combination of online intake and external forms. All right, so there was one last thing I just wanted to show you. I know we've kind of described this whole transfer process and everything along the way, but I did just want to show you an example of what it looks like when we actually have an online intake transferred to our site.
And Leah, while you're doing that, something that I just wanted to describe is the process. Part of the magic of the online intake is that it sends your site just enough information to do a conflict check and then goes back and gets the rest of the data, which I know is what you're about to show, but you might think, well, why don't I just have somebody custom make some HTML for me? And part of the reason is that it has these extra integration steps, like being able to hold the data and not send the rest until you've done a conflict check. And also, as Leah has shown, and I have something I can share when you're done here, Leah, you could direct to one of many LegalServer sites and track that. So,
great, thank you, Jeff.
Over to
you.
And
I will show you, show you exactly what Jeff is talking about here. So when a online intake is complete, and by complete, I mean that they have filled out all of the various pages and gotten to the last step, which would have the transfer block on it, which is the magic one that's going to transfer it right over to your regular site. But as Jeff was describing, it's not just going to add that case right to your site. So what it's going to do is if I click on this cases tab, and this is just our demo site here, but it is connected to that demo online intake site, you're going to have a new tab. If you're already using electronic transfers, this would not be a new tab, but a pending transfers tab. And this is basically like your holding tank for these online intakes coming in. So these are all online intakes that made it all the way through the process, were transferred over here, but they're not actually part of our database yet. They're in this holding tank until we look at it, do our conflict check, and decide if we want to go ahead and invite it into our site. So you're going to notice a lot of these already have our e-transfer initiated. So I'm going to come down to this one that does not. So you'll see that status there. I'm going to click into it, and I'm going to see that pending transfer profile. So this is what Jeff was talking about as far as just seeing really limited data, enough to do our conflict check and see some basic things like what kind of case is it. So we can see it's a mortgage foreclosure case. I can see obviously our client name. I can do our conflict check. So you have that link just like you would with a pre-screen. And then all the way at the bottom, I can just add some notes and save them. I can go ahead and begin intake. So that's saying that I think we're going to be able to take this case. I don't see any conflicts or any obvious reason we can't. Click continue, and now you have accepted the case into your site. You could absolutely still reject it later, just like any regular intake, but you've basically said that you want to go ahead and make this case record in your regular database. The other option, of course, is to go ahead and reject it. So if I found a conflict, or I see that it's a housing issue and we're not going to help with housing issues, I can go ahead and reject this right away, and it kicks this case right out of my database. So it's as if it never existed, because it didn't really. It was just sitting here in this holding tank, and we had to kick it out for whatever reason. Of course, you get to choose your reject reason from your list here. And then again, it's like it was never here. Now, of course, you would still have the record that this person filled out an online intake. That would exist in your online intake site. So again, two separate databases. It would still exist there. You just would not have it in your regular database. Oh, and I see in the chat from Mallory a really good point and something to bring up, which is just talking about how you can also have multiple online intake processes on your online intake site. So basically, if let's just say that you have your online intake site and you have one application for clients to fill out, and another application for representatives, like their guardian ad litem or their healthcare advocate. So you have two separate processes that are being utilized on your online intake site. Both of those can be used. Both of those can transfer to your regular site. And there is a field now that will tell you which of those it came from. So this, it's not filled out because we're just not using it on this demo site, but this originating agency program column would tell us which of those online intakes that it actually came from. So I could see that some of these were for the regular client online intake, some of them were for our healthcare worker online intake, or whatever kind of versions of online intake that we are utilizing. So that was a great point, Mallory. I don't think I had actually mentioned yet that you could have multiple online intakes on your online intake site. You certainly can. So they could be for different audiences. They could be for different purposes. You could even have a housing online intake, a family law online intake if you really wanted to. And those, again, could all transfer over, and you'd be able to utilize that agency program field to just differentiate which online intake they started from. Oh, and I see just another note from Mallory, also good info here, that she mentioned she's starting to see a few programs use online intake to enter cases coming from offsite clinic locations, where a staff member or volunteer is completing the online intake. Of course, as she noted, not right now with all of our social distancing, but you could also utilize it for things like those clinics, where, you know, someone could be sitting down with the applicant and entering that as well. And I see a question, can applicants apply for help with more than one legal issue at once? So they are utilizing that legal problem code field is only going to allow them to select one legal problem code, but you absolutely could build in some custom fields to ask about additional issues. So you could have just a text box where they could write about their additional issues. Once you accept that case into your database, you could see that and say, hey, I noticed, you know, you also mentioned you're going through a divorce. Should we open up a case for you? And then you could do your case copy for that. The other option, of course, would be to have them enter an online intake for each of those legal issues. But you could certainly, you know, utilize custom fields to capture that information, but they could only choose one legal problem code from that system list. And I see, can you not include legal problem code for the client to fill out and do it later? Yes, you absolutely could. So you could just have them, you know, enter, these are all of the different legal issues I'm facing. And then once you get the case, you'd be able to decide if you need to copy it to create more, you know, more cases for that client. And I see the question, so when a case is rejected from here, is there an email the applicant option to inform them we won't be accepting their case? There's not from this rejection page. You certainly could go into your online intake site and do something like write a case note on that record and email that note out to the applicant. Typically, what most programs that I've worked with will do is instead, they will just note in the online intake that if you don't hear from us from X number or in X number of days, it means we're not able to help you. You know, if you want to follow up, call our office. Or kind of put the burden on them that, you know, if they don't hear back from you, it means you weren't able to help them. So that's what I see most of the time, just to kind of mitigate that. But you would be able to, again, you know, go through your online intake site to email from there if you wanted to. All right, so I think I caught all of the questions in the chat so far. Oh, sorry, one last thing from Mallory to share, that there are some new submitters name and submitters email fields that you can send a confirmation email. Oh, okay, awesome, yeah. So you can send the confirmation email that the OI was received. So if you do want to send out that email, there are ways in the online intake itself to send an automatic email. There's a send email block. So you'd be able to utilize, you know, who submitted it and send an email to that person, just confirming that it was submitted. All right, so I see that Jeff wants to share a couple of things with us as well. So I'm going to stop my share and hand it over to you, Jeff.
Great, thanks, Leah. Do you see my screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Terrific. All right, so this is an example. Actually, Chris Schwartz may be on the call. He helped build this with some partners in New York City. This is an example of a sort of area-specific online intake. This is just on consumer issues. I like it that team decided to keep all this very short. There's not a big long waiver that nobody reads for them to scroll through. So they kept it very brief. Like what do we absolutely have to ask people? Right, so we're still down to a very small number of questions. And I wanted to point out, although it took quite a bit of work to think through how to do this, that team decided that one of the things we wanted to do is show as much in plain language as we could. And so this one never actually asks the end user about a specific legal problem code. It's being set, but we're not saying, is this a 63 landlord tenant, you know, because they don't know what problem codes are. So it uses the legal problem code descriptive and then also some branch logic to just sort of hide that and set it behind the scenes. This one I thought was pretty clever too. We decided if they say they're not sure what kind of bankruptcy they need, it's probably a Chapter 7, but we'll find out once they get an actual full intake. So they're shown a little bit of information about Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and maybe that's enough information for them to answer their question and we're done, maybe. But if not, they can go ahead and enter more information and get a referral. That team decided that they needed to put a phone number in. So you'll notice there's very few required fields here. Name, zip code, phone number. That's it. That's all that was required. And that's a philosophy, not the only one, for keeping this easy for people to fill out. So we asked very few required questions. And this income information is super small, right? How many people are in the household who are under 18, over 18, a little bit of really basic stuff about wages, and that's it. That's the full financial at this step, right? So like if you're LSC funded, you're going to have to ask them more stuff later, but this is to keep at a very high level, analyze where what they might be eligible for. And what this does is this uses a block that's available to you now. It's called ART, the application routing tool. It's a block you can put on online intake here at the end. And what it does is it lets you sort by several criteria at the same time. What Leah showed works totally fine. There is a conditional branch logic, which captures quite a bit of this. But you can see that what you do is you put each organization it might be referred to. You put information about them in the online intake site, including what problem codes, counties, poverty max, age ranges they accept. And then you'll note that what it does is it looks at that list. And in this case, based on what I filled in, it picked just one agency. Well, actually, it will always, the ART block will typically show just one agency that matches, even if several match. But there's a button to show other ones that also match. The idea being, maybe people don't want to, how does an end user know to choose between these two? They probably don't. So there's sort of a round robin logic that will show these agencies. And then if I clicked on refer me, if it's a LegalServer agency, everything else happens exactly as Leah describes. You get an e-transfer notice over in the destination site. And if you have a partner who's not a LegalServer client, the best we can do is send them an email, right? Because so far we don't have one that really accepts this via API. But you can also cleverly, you can use like an email template. So you can say, dear agency that doesn't have LegalServer, Bob applied. Maybe we're not using anything else more personally identifiable because it's email. Applied. He appears to be eligible at the 127% poverty level and has a problem with bankruptcy, Chapter 7. And here's his phone number. So that's how that works. That's an example of like 5 agencies now, and who knows, there may be more down the line, sharing a single online intake site. But the real work here, if you're going to collaborate with your friends, which I hope you will, is getting the team together to decide on things like keeping the waiver really short and how are we going to ask these questions, and then gathering what services each agency wants to get referrals on. All that human coordination is a lot of the work. And people like Mallory's been through this quite a bit, the folks especially who've weighed into the more complex configurations know that it's that human part of figuring out what your business rules are going to be that takes some real effort and collaboration. But at the end of the day, you get to share same online intake interview, and you don't have 5 people trying to update this stuff all the time. So something to consider. Anything to add to that, Leah?
Awesome. No, yeah, that was great. Thank you for adding that.
Sure. Something to look for also in the future as we build out other referral tools, including referral hub coming around the corner, will be even more sophisticated versions of that matching process. So if you feel lonely or daunted by online intake, grab a friend, do it with them. That's it. Thank you, Leah.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, and I don't think we have any outstanding questions in the chat. All right, so yeah, it looks like we've got everything answered that has been asked so far. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope you got some helpful information about online intake and how it can be utilized in all of these different ways, and hopefully help out with all of us working more remotely these days.
Great. Thank you, Leah.
All right, thanks all. Have a good one.